Okay, so our lesson for today is all about measuring risks. Okay, so in epidemiology, we measure risk time to time. Okay, to be able to know or to uh, prepare for forthcoming na mga different epidemiological crisis. Okay, so what is risk, by the way? So first, we're going to know or to give the objectives of this discussion, to identify the measures of a stationary risk as they are used in epidemiology. Okay, to interpret the relative risk and odds ratio and be familiar with their calculations. Okay, and lastly, to interpret the following measures of risk differences: attributable risk, population attributable risk, and population attributable risk percent. Okay, so meron tayo niya guidelines on how to calculate and how to derive the different computations for this specific na mga basis or terms sa measuring of risks. Okay, so first we need to define what is risk. Risk class in epidemiology use the term risk to mean the probability of an outcome. Okay, it is often a negative outcome. For example, it is usually in a specified period of time. Okay, so usually class risk is equate or risk of dying. Okay, in epidemiology, risk usually implies a quantifiable concept such as risk of dying or the risk of heart attack. Okay, so in the practice of public health, a quantitative estimate of risk is usually in the making decisions about course of action or intervention, as well as how to allocate finite resources or time and money. Okay, so risk is somehow a probability of an outcome. Okay, so why do we need to determine risk? Bakit kailangan aralan ng risk? Okay, so ang sabi dito class, risk is very important to be determined in order for us to prepare for incoming na mga situations. Okay, and to prepare the resources for it. Okay, for example, katulad ng nangyayari ngayon class, COVID-19 is not prepared or hindi prepared ang country natin or the world even for COVID-19, di ba? We do not know that this type of infection is possible. Okay? So it occurred. Okay? But unfortunately, the risk of committing or having been infected of this type of pathogen is somehow different to other types of infection. Yes, we are prepared of different types of illness like tuberculosis or flu, di ba? We know the risk of those types of infection. That's why the government is already prepared of vaccines or medication for that type of diseases for an outbreak. But unfortunately, COVID-19 is very new, di ba? Although we are we do experience a similar type of infection because we have already encountered MERS-CoV, we have already encountered SARS-CoV, but it is not that lethal compared to what we experience now. The mortality rate for COVID-19 is that high that even scientists, di ba, they weren't able to justify yung vaccine for it. Diba? Until now, ongoing pa rin ang process of developing the vaccine. Okay? Kasi nga, we are not prepared. Even yung money and resources and time for the development of vaccines and medications for this infection, wala tayo nun. Okay? We were not prepared for the risk. Okay? So, diba, it is very timely and important to be discussing this type of topics, di ba? Defining risk. Pero not only that type of infection class, maraming klase ng risk. For example, ito, probability of an outcome is specified in a period of time. For example, ang risk class is also known as probability or likelihood. Likelihood to be, likelihood na maka-encounter ng infection or likelihood na magkaroon ng sakit. Okay? So, A quantitative estimate of risk provides us with evidence to make public health choices. Okay, so if we determine risk class, we can stop or we can eliminate yung probability na magkaroon ka ng sakit. For example, chronic heart disease. Ano ba ang risk niyan? Okay, eating of unhealthy foods, di ba? And eating of fatty and salty foods can be a risk. Okay, a risk to have a chronic or cardiovascular disease. So if you eliminate that risk, you stop eating unhealthy foods, you stop eating fatty foods, you do exercise every day or make a healthy lifestyle, probably you will eliminate that risk and maiwasan to have a cardiovascular disease. So that's why it is very important to know or to define what is risk in epidemiology. Okay, so next, we need also to determine what is risk and what is association. Okay, so in epidemiology class, association means a correlation. Di ba we have already discussed this from our previous topic about correlation. Correlation is also known as relationship. Okay, so oftentimes na interchange yung dalawang terms na to, the risk and association. Pag sinabi mong risk kasi class, it is probably a precursor or of a certain illness. Pag ginawa mo ito, magkakaroon ka ng sakit na ganito. Okay? Association naman class is pwedeng magkaroon, pwedeng hindi. So that is association. Related lang sila, but it is not a probable reason to encounter this type of illness. For example, risk of sabi ko kanina, eating or having an unhealthy lifestyle, that's a risk to have a cardiovascular disease. Association naman, probably, if you have diabetes, okay, it's a probability na pwede ka magkaroon ng, or it is an association na pwede ka magkaroon ng cardiovascular disease. Okay, but it is not necessarily mean that if meron kang diabetes, meron ka din cardiovascular disease. Pwede kang magkaroon, pwede hindi. That is association. Okay? So, correlation lang siya. Correlation is a situation in which two or more variables, in this case, exposure and outcome, change at the same time. Okay. For example, as exposure to the sun increases, the incidence for some type of cancer increases. Okay, katulad ng example natin kanina, pag lumala ang iyong diabetes, pwede ding lumala or pwede kang magkaroon ng cardiovascular disease. Katulad ng example itong sa nila, associated sun, exposure to sunlight, and to skin cancer. Okay, but not necessarily na pag nag-expose to sunlight is not entirely associated to cancer, but it is a possibility. Okay, if you increase your exposure to sunlight, probably pwede kang magkaroon ng a type of cancer, probably skin cancer, diba? Where an association is thought to be causal, as in the association between smoking and lung cancer. So it is a probability class, no, that if you smoke, you will develop lung cancer. But it is not an absolute reason that if you smoke, lung cancer agad. Not necessarily. But according to studies, yes, 90% of people with lung cancer is associated to smoking. So yan yung reason. Okay? So thus, we often use the term risk factor in referring to the exposure we are comparing. So take for example itong case natin sa gilid, risk versus association. Diba? Association or correlation between exposure and outcome. So correlation variable change at the same time. So sabi na natin kanina, increased exposure to sunlight will also increase your possibility to have skin cancer. Correlation does not equal to causation. Hindi siya absolute. Pag sinabi nagpainit ka or nag-expose ka sa sun, hindi agad-agad na magkaroon ka ng skin cancer. That's not the real thing, or that is not association. Okay? So according to your class, association thought to be causal. So measures of association, we have different types of measurements for association. we have relative risk, odds ratio, attributable risk, risk difference, population attributable risk, and population attributable risk percentage. Okay? So here, class, we have different terms on how we equate or paano natin ma-measure yung risks. So we have three options or three ways to measure risk. We do it using ratio, we do it with proportions, and with rates. So what is ratio? Ratio is the comparison of two things. Okay? It can either be related to each other or pwede hindi din. Proportion, on the other hand, the numerator is included in denominator. So kung sa ratio, pwede hindi sila pareho. Si proportion naman, class, the numerator is always part of the denominator. Okay? And lastly, we have rates. Proportion related to time. So usually, class, proportion is used with the unit of time. So in a certain period of time, ang rates. Okay? So it uses a constant multiplier. Okay? So let's talk about this measurement individually. Okay? So first, we have ratio. Okay? A ratio, class, is a relative magnitude of two quantities or comparison of any two values. It is calculated by dividing one interval or ratio scale variable by the other. The numerator and denominator need not be related. Katulad na sabi natin kanina, pwede hindi pareho or hindi magkatulad yung dalawang variables for ratio. Okay, so ang formula for ratio, class, is number or rate of events, items, persons, etc. in a group versus another number of rates of events, items, person, etc. in another group. So calculating ratio, so after the numerator is divided by the denominator, the result is often expressed as a result to 1 or is written as to 1. Okay, ganito ang written niya, colon and then 1. Okay. So paano ginagawa ito? You divide the denominator, either the denominator or the numerator by itself, so that yung isang value sa kanila maging 1. So take for example itong category na ito, calculating a ratio, different categories of same variables. Okay, so between 1971 and 1975, there is a study about diabetes. Okay, so the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey conducted this research study for 7,381 persons, ages 40 to 77 years. So they were enrolled in this study, and after, I think, how many years, they go back to those people. So after they started again calculating or investigating the participants from year 1982 to 1984. So first nila yung encounter ito. Okay? Yung initial talaga, class, so they employed 4 different types of data variables. Diabetic man, men, non-diabetic men, diabetic women, and non-diabetic women. So in 1971 to 1975, so for 5 years. So for diabetic men, they got 189. For non-diabetic, they got 3,151. 218 for diabetic women, and 3,823 for the non-diabetic women. So after, class, some ilang years, so nag-follow up sila. Same people from 1982 to 1984. Ilang years? 75, 76, 7, 8, 89, 80, 182. So after 7 years, binalikan nila yung the same people. Okay. Sa noong 1982, class, yung 189 na diabetic man na naiwan nila ang namatay is 100. Okay, so 89 na lang ang naiwan. Ang non-diabetic men, out of 3,151, ang namatay doon is 811. Sa diabetic women, ang namatay is 72, and ang non-diabetic women, ang namatay is 511. So we can calculate it using ratio. Okay? So for example, yung ratio mo is for of men enrolled in this study follow-up study 301 were non-diabetic and 189 were diabetic. So ito yung calculation mo. So ito yung ginamit mo na variables. So inalculate mo ang non-diabetic men to diabetic men. Okay? So non-diabetic man is 3,151 over 189 na diabetic. And then times 1. Okay? So 3,151 divided by 189. Okay. You calculate it, then times 1. Okay. So 3,151 divided by 189. So you got 16.7 or 16.67. In other words, class, 16.7 is to 1. Okay? Ibig sabihin, one diabetic, for 16.7 men na hindi diabetic, mayroong isang diabetic. So that is ratio. Okay? First, you divide the numerator to the denominator and then times it to 1. Okay? Nakuha ba si ratio? Okay, so why do we need, or ano ba ang mga functions ng ratio, class? So ratios are common descriptive measures used in the fields. So in epidemiology, ratios are usually both descriptive measure and analytic tools. Okay, di ba we have already discussed descriptive and analytic. For descriptive, it is usually a description of the data. So in the form of tables, charts, or mga numerical values. While in analytic data or analytic tools, we usually do hypothesis. Okay? So in ratio analysis, the numerator and denominator of the ratio can be related or unrelated. In other words, you are free to use ratio to compare the numbers of males in the population with the numbers of females or the population. So, pwedeng related yun. That's related in the population. Pwede namang hindi. Diba? For example, you compare the number of residents in a population with the number of hospitals or dollars spent over-the-counter medicines. Pwedeng yun din. So, they are not related to each other, but you compare them. So, yun yung function ni, or yung significance ni ratio. Usually, the values of both numerator and denominator of the ratio are divided by the values of one another. Okay? Or one or the other, so that either the numerator or the denominator equals to 1. Okay? So, pwede kasing gawin natin yung una kanina, isang reason yun to get the values of denominator, di ba? Or you equate them to their values on each other. So for example, non-diabetic, for example, kanina, di ba? We have 16.7 is to 1, or kasi di ba, usually class, ito yung nire-report, yung 16.7 is to 1, kumpara naman sa 3,151 to 189. Masyadong malaki yung values na to be reported or to be on different datas of epidemiological na mga status. Okay? So usually ito yung makikita mo, 16.7 is to 1. Ibig sabihin yan, you have one diabetic for every 16.7 na non-diabetic men. So that is an example of ratio. Okay? So in epidemiology, what is the most common type of ratio? Okay? So we have death to case ratio. So death to case ratio, class, is a number of deaths attributed to a particular disease during a specified period divided by the number of new cases of that disease identified during the same period. Okay. So usually, class, death to case ratio yung ginagamit to know the severity or to know the intensity of that illness or that type of infection. For example, let's say for example, it is used to measure the severity of illness. Death to case ratio for rabies is close to 1. Ibig sabihin, lahat ng cases of rabies, every case of rabies, halos namamatay yung patient. So ibig sabihin that pag close to 1 ang isang death to case ratio, class, ibig sabihin lahat ng may ganong case, is leading to death. That is, almost everyone who develops rabies dies from it. Okay, so that is death to case ratio. Whereas the death to case ratio for common colds is close to 0. Ibig sabihin, so lahat na nagkakaroon ng common colds, gumagaling. Okay, so that's the interpretation of death to case ratio. Okay, so if you notice class, itong death to case ratio dito sa side. So these are death to case ratio of countries. Okay, so ito, almost 0, 0.05, 0.01, 0.15. So ang pinakamataas dito is Belgium, yung case to death ratio. Okay, yung pinakamataas is Belgium at ang pinakamaliit is Russia. So almost confirmed cases na mamatay. Diba? Lahat ng confirmed cases nila na mamatay. I think if I'm not mistaken, this is COVID-19. Okay? If I'm not mistaken, this is COVID-19. So lahat ng cases in that particular country na mamatay. Okay? So next, can you see, nakikita niyo ba ang screen?
Sir.
Nakikita niyo ba?
Wala pa po.
Okay. So wait lang baka...
Hindi pa sir, loading po.
Load. Wait lang Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. So, commonly used epidemiologic ratio divided natin kanina is the death to case ratio. So, let's take for example this type of infection, which is tuberculosis. In United States in 2002, a total of 15,075 new cases of tuberculosis were reported. So, during the same year, 802 deaths were attributed to tuberculosis. So, if you notice, 15,075 total case. Okay? So, new cases of tuberculosis were reported. At yung 15,075, out of the 15,075, merong namatay na 802. So, that is the ratio. The tuberculosis death to case ratio in 2002 can be calculated as 802 over 15,075. So, you divide both the numerator with itself. Okay? Okay, for example, divide mo ang 800 you divide 802 to 802 and you divide 15,075 to 802. That gives you one for every death class, for every new cases of tuberculosis, meron isang namamatay. Okay? So that gives you this type of answer or death to case ratio. Diba? You have 802 to 15,075. Pwede mo siyang kunin if you divide 15,075 to 802 din. Okay? You both divide the two values, you divide it to 802. That gives you 1 to 18.8. Ibig sabihin again, you get 1 death for every 18.8 new cases of tuberculosis. But in other words, ganito siya class. So, pero pwede mo rin kunin using if you divide it with 15,075. Okay. For example, ito. Okay. You divide 802 to 15,075 and 15,075 divided by 15,075. That gives you, okay, 802 divided by 50,075. That gives you 0.053. But since 1 na lang ang naiwan, you multiply it to 100. Okay, kasi nga point value siya. So, ang mangyari class, you get 5.3. So, ang mangyari, you get 5.3 death per 100 new cases of tuberculosis. So either both of the expressions are correct. Okay? Pareho lang silang tama. It's on how you going to deliver or how you're going to interpret. Okay. Or how you're going to interpret yung data mo. Okay? Naintindihan ba? It's either you can do it using you divide it with the numerator. We divide it with 802. Both of them getting 1 out of 18.8, or we divide both of them with 15,075 and multiply it to 100, giving you 100 cases. So that gives you 5.3 deaths per 100 cases. So either of that two is a valid interpretation of the case. Okay? Next we have proportion. Diba? Ito yung second measurement of risk, proportion. Proportion class is comparison of parts of the whole. It is type of ratio in which the numerator is included in the denominator. Ibig sabihin, parte sa numerator ng entity ni denominator. Yung katulad kanina, sa ratio, pwedeng hindi related yung dalawa. Pwedeng pareho, pwedeng related. Okay? But ito class, si proportion, part talaga ng numerator part ng denominator si numerator. You might use a proportion to describe what fraction of clinic patients tested positive for HIV or what percentage of population is younger than 25 years of age. A proportion may be expressed as decimal, fraction, or percentage. So there are three ways on how you are going to interpret proportion. Pwede decimal, fraction, or percentage. So if you notice class, itong rationals, di ba? Yung pinakamaliit, part siya ng malaki, and then so on and so forth. So para siya proportion, di ba? Lahat ng nasa loob, lahat ng numerator are part of the denominator. Okay? So methods of calculating proportion class is the number of person or events with a particular characteristic over the total number of persons, events of which the numerator is a subset. Ibig sabihin, part sa numerator nitong subset. Okay? So, how do you calculate for the proportion? So, for example, ito class. Ito pa rin yung data natin kanina for diabetic. Okay? So, numerator mo is 189 diabetic men, at saka denominator mo is 189 plus 3,151, di ba? Ang 3,151 mo is yung non-diabetic men. So, in order to get yung entire number of men tested in that specific study, you need to get the number for both non-diabetic and diabetic. Okay, so you add 189 plus 3,151, so that is 3,340. So that means that your proportion is 189 over 3,340. Okay, pwede na ito siya. This is already a proportion, fraction. Okay, ratio na ito. Diba, fraction? Or you can do it using a percentage. So you divide 189 divided by 189 divided by 3,340. Okay. So you divide, diba? It is equivalent to 0.05658. And then you times it to 100 for it to become percentage. So that's 5.658 or 5.66. Okay, so ito na yung proportion for diabetic men out of the total number. Okay, so example B naman, calculate the proportion of death among men. So ito yung example kanina ng diabetic. And then, so 100 deaths in diabetic men plus 811 deaths in non-diabetic man. Okay, so kinuha mo siya. So that gives you 911 deaths in men. So how do you compute for all deaths? Okay, so 911 plus 72 in diabetic women plus 511, okay, for non-diabetic women. Okay. So, ang gusto mong malaman dito is yung proportion ng lahat ng ang goal mo dito sa example na to class is you wanted to get the number or the proportion of death for men out of the total number of death all in all. Okay, so you added all the deaths, both diabetic, non-diabetic men and women. So you get 1,494 deaths all in all. Okay, so you compute for the death of men na 911. So you get 911 over 1,494. So you divide lang 900 divided by 1,000. 911 divided by 1,494 times, so you get 0.60977 times 100. Okay, so you get 60.977 or 61%. Okay, so 61% of total number of deaths is men. Okay, so ganun ang proportion. Okay, 61% of the total number of deaths is men. Okay, so that is proportion. Okay, so what is the most common type of proportion? Loading. Okay, so the most common type of okay, so proportion class are usually done to get the estimate of an event or an illness out of the number of population. So why do we need to discuss or to know what is proportion? The proportions are usually used to describe the amount of disease that can be attributed to a particular exposure. On the basis of studies of smoking and lung cancer, public health officials have estimated that greater than 90% of lung cancer cases occur or attributable to cigarette smoking. Ito yung sabi ko kanina, di ba? So 90% of people having lung cancer is smokers. Okay. So in a proportion, the numerator must be included in the denominator. Thus, the number of apples divided by the number of oranges is not proportion. So dapat the numerator is always part of the denominator. Hindi pwede magkaiba. Okay? So pwede example mo is the number of apples by the total number of fruits of all kinds. Pwede yun. That's a proportion. So remember, the numerator is always a subset of the denominator. Okay? So a proportion can be expressed as fraction, katulad nung kanina. Actually, class, yung kanina, that's already a proportion, fraction. But you wanted it to become a percentage. Mas maganda kasi tingnan if naka-percentage siya, di ba, or decimal. So, usually, class, ang nakikita mo sa mga book or sa mga data, percentage. Okay? So, the statements of 1/5 of the residents became ill and 20% of the residents became ill are equivalent or pareho lang. So 1/5 and 20% are the same values. Okay? So proportions can easily be converted to ratio if the numerator is the number of women who attended the clinic and the denominator is all of the clinic attendees. Okay, so you have 179 for women and 341 out of the total. Ibig sabihin, you divide it. So you divide 179 to 341. So ano ba? So you divide 179 divided by 341 times 100. So that is yung 52.49%. So 15% lang ginamit dito. So more than half. So paano mo naman malaman yung number of males? So you minus lang. So 341 minus 179, that is 162. Ibig sabihin, you have 179 men and 179 women and 162 men. So that is that is ratio. Diba? 170, sorry, no? 179 over 162. Ibig sabihin, that's the ratio. But if you are interpreting for proportion, you say 179 out of 341 or 162 out of 341 are men. So that is proportion. Okay? So if you calculate it using yung estimate class, you get 1.1 to 1 female to male ratio. How do you do this? You divide it by itself. Okay? For example, 179 divided by 179. Okay, that's 1. So, 179 divided by 162. Okay, so 1.1. So you have 1.1 is to 1 for the ratio of male and female. Nakuha mo niyo ba? So take for example ito class. This is a ratio of men and women. These are proportions or ratio of men and women that are using social media. So 40% of men out of 100, so that's proportion. But if you do this like 40 to 60, this is ratio. 40% men and 60% women. For Facebook, 43 for men and 57 for women. For Google, 63 for men, 37 for women. Okay? But if you do it on with a percentage or if in a 100, so 63% of 100, so that is proportion. Okay? What is the most common type of proportion? So we have, yung kanina, di ba sa ratio, the most common type of ratio is case to death ratio. Di ba? Ito naman class, sa proportion, the most common type of proportion class is proportionate mortality. So what is proportionate mortality? It is a proportion of death in a specified population during a period of time that are attributable to different causes. So each cause is expressed as percentage of all death and the sum of the total number of deaths will be 100%. So these proportions are not rates because the denominator is all death, not the size of a population in which the death occurred. Nasa lista sa the next page yan. Okay? In 2003, persons of all ages and persons of age 24 to 44 years old by number of death proportionate to mortality and harm. So take for example itong data natin sa side. So these are health transition proportionate mortality by broad cause of death in the US. So if you notice, from 1900s to probably 1940s, no? 1900s to 1940s, the leading cause of death for almost 50% is infectious diseases. Again, if you notice, from 1900s to 1940s, from 40 to 50% of the leading cause of death is infectious diseases. The remaining naman is others. Diba? So, ano yung reason kung bakit infectious disease yung naging leading cause of death during those times? Probability is wala pang vaccination or underdeveloped yung vaccines for the different types of infectious diseases. May it be viral, bacterial infection. So, and if you notice class, no, from 1940s, in the middle of 1940s to 1970, the leading cause of death naman is CVD or cardiovascular disease. Diba, 1940, bumaba yung rate of death for infectious diseases. Probably, na-develop na yung vaccines at we already had different medications or cure for infectious diseases. So, mababa na yung rate of infectious diseases. Ang tumaas naman is cardiovascular disease. The overall cardiovascular disease class is a lifestyle-based in death or illness. Ibig sabihin, if you eat fatty foods, you eat salty foods, having bad lifestyle or unhealthy lifestyle, you will certainly be developing cardiovascular disease. So, 1940s to 1970s na-develop na or meron ng fast foods, meron ng nightlife, meron ng drugs. So, probably ito yung cause kung bakit yung leading cause of death is cardiovascular disease. So if you equate lahat ng ito, that is 100%. Okay? So ito yung ating table kanina. So if you notice class, hinati yung dalawang age. So all ages, ito. If you notice class, for all ages, ang leading cause of death is disease of the heart or cardiovascular disease. Rank 1 siya in all ages. But if you notice, this was 2003, no? Yung data na to is 2003. But if you notice, class, for the ages 25 to 44, the leading cause of death is accidents and injury. Di ba? Pangatlo lang ata si heart disease. Number 1, si accidents or unintentional injuries like car accidents, ano pa ba? Yung mga death by nabanggaan, di ba? So, usually yan yung naging cause of death. Probably accidents like drinking while driving, yan. So, accidents. Pero age 25 to 44. So, this is recklessness probably, no? But in all ages, number 1, say disease of heart. Okay? So that is the most common example of proportion, the mortality, proportionate mortality. Now let's go to the third type of measurement, which is rate. Rate class in epidemiology, a rate is a measure of frequency with which an event occurs in a defined population over a specified period of time. Because rates put disease frequency in the perspective of size of the population. Rates are particularly useful for comparing disease frequency in different locations at different times or among different groups of persons with potentially different size population. That is a rate of measure of risk. So rate class is usually accompanied with a measure unit or a time unit. A particular measurement of time is accompanied the data for rate. Okay? So, katulad nito, rate is always reported for some unit of time. Some epidemiologists restrict use of term rate to similar measures that are expressed per unit of time. So, may ibang epidemiologists class na they are not using this particular dimension or particular na formula. So, walang time usually. They do it on a percentage or do it on decimal without the unit of time. So, may mga epidemiologists or mga data na ganun ang pagbasa ng rate. For this, epidemiologist rate describes on how quickly disease occurs in a population. For example, 17 new cases of breast cancer per 1,000 women per year. So, merong unit of time na per year. So, meron kang 17 new cases per 1,000 women per year. So, nakita niyo ba ang nasa rate class? The new cases, ito yung cases, the population, the number of population, and the unit of time. Diba? So, again, in a rate class, tatlo ang iyong titingnan. Yung case, the number of population, and the unit of time. So these measures are not necessarily all rate ganito ha. Mayroong ibang rate class, 70 out of 1,000 rate na yun sa kanila. Pero ang tamang pagsulat ng rate class is usually with a unit of time. So this measure conveys a sense of speed with which disease occurs in a population. So magtataka ka, ay, ang dami namang cases in 1 year, di ba? For example, ito COVID-19, di ba? In the Philippines, we started 1, di ba? If you notice from, I think, nag-start siya ng December. We have December or January, di ba? We have 1 or 2 cases. So, bigla siyang dumami. So, that's a speed. That's a rate, di ba? So, for example, you have 2 cases per day. Madami na yon. And umabot din tayo dito ng 35 cases or 700 cases in the whole country. Even sa Janssen, di ba? We got 55 yung pinaka-latest, di ba? We have 55 cases per day. Di ba? So that's the rate. 55 cases out of 1,000 plus case of exposure in a certain day or certain week. So that's rate. Okay? So, so this measure conveys a sense of speed with which disease occurs in the population. It seems to imply that this pattern has occurred and will continue to occur for a foreseeable future. So, if for example, this day, tatlo, tomorrow tatlo din, probably in the next few days, tatlo ang positive. So that's a rate. So, for example, 7 times 3 for a week. So you have 21 cases per week. So that's a speed. So that's an example of rate. Okay? So why do we need to discuss rate, class? Okay? So rate is being used, class, to determine yung speed or the intensity ng pag-spread ng infection or pagdaki ng infection. So we have different types of rate. Okay? First of which is attack rate. Attack rate is a proportion of the population that develops illness during an outbreak. Okay? So meron siyang specified time. For example, 21 of 130 persons develop diarrhea after attending a picnic. So, in an alternative and more accurate phrase for attack rate is incidence proportion. Again, attack rate is usually used to determine yung number of cases in a certain time of an outbreak. Okay? Meron lang siyang specific number of population, specific date, and it is also known as incidence proportion. That's attack rate. Next is prevalence rate. Prevalence rate, class, is the proportion of a population that has a health condition at a point of time. For example, 70 influenza cases in March 2005. Kung kanina, outbreak lang, ibig sabihin, at a certain period lang, yung time na nagkaroon lang ng diarrhea is during picnic. So that's the time. That's an outbreak. Ito naman, prevalence rate, class, is merong specified date. Diba? 70 influenza cases in the month of March 2005. So that's a prevalence rate. Okay? And lastly, we have case fatality rate. This is a proportion of a person with the disease who die from it. So for example, one death due to meningitis among the country A's population. So it is used, a case fatality naman is the proportion of death in a given partial case, case ratio, case to death ratio. But sa case to death ratio kasi, class, that's estimate. Okay? Sa case fatality naman, class, is a real data. Okay? A specific data. Ibig sabihin, one specific death to meningitis in that specific country. Okay? That is case fatality rate. So if you notice, class, no, rate is also a proportion but with a unit of time. Okay, if you notice, those three examples of rates are proportion also. So they are, so in other words, class, rate is a proportion with a certain population, rate is a proportion of certain population in a certain a period of time. So that is rate. All of these measures are proportions and none is expressed per unit of time. Therefore, these measures are not considered true rates. Okay. So if you notice, hindi siya totoo rate daw. But according to their definition, they are using these types of terms or terminologies in datas. Okay? So, let's categorize, or these are the categories of the different types of ratio, proportion, and rate used in death, disease, and birth. So, morbidity, we also refer it to disease. Okay, nagkasakit. Okay, so ano yung mga ratio na ginagamit sa morbidity? We have risk ratio, rate ratio, odds ratio, and period prevalence. So we're going to discuss that individually. So for proportion, for morbidity and proportion, we have attack rate, secondary rate, point prevalence, and attributable proportion. And for rate, we have person, time, incidence rate. Now, for mortality, we have death to case ratio, we have proportionate mortality for proportion, and for rate class, we have crude mortality rate, case fatality rate, cause-specific mortality, age-specific mortality rate, maternal mortality, and infant mortality. So we're going to discuss that on our next topics, okay? Succeeding topics natin. And for natality, or also known as birth rate, okay? So ano lang siya, wala siyang ratio, wala siyang proportion, rate lang. So crude birth rate and crude fertility rate. Okay? Now let's go to measuring frequencies. Okay, so morbidity, also known as disease class. So morbidity, nagkasakit ka, okay, in a population. So morbidity has been defined as any departure, subjective or objective, from a state of physiological or psychological well-being. Hindi okay ang physiological mo, hindi okay ang psychological, that leads to illness. Okay, that's morbidity. In practice, morbidity encompasses disease, injury, and disability. So either of those three will constitute for morbidity. So in addition, although for this lesson, the term refers to the number of persons who are ill, it can also be used to describe the periods of illness that these persons experience or duration of these illnesses. So, ibig sabihin, morbidity is not only limited to that illness alone, but also to kung kailan siya nagkaroon ng sakit, or the period kung hanggang kailan siya nagkasakit, or the duration of this illness. Gaano ba siya katagal before siya gumaling? Okay? Measures of morbidity frequency characterize the number of person in a population who become ill. So ilan yung nagkasakit and ilan ang population. For example, in Bula, we have estimated 2,000 population. So ilan ang nagkaroon ng COVID-19 sa Bula? Probably we have 5. So in a given period of time. So in a week, we have 5 infected COVID-19 infected cases, out of 2,000 na population in a given period of time in a certain area. So that's morbidity frequency measure. Okay? So sa morbidity frequency measure class, measures of morbidity, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 5 types of measurements for morbidity frequency. First, we have incidence proportion. So what is incidence proportion? Also known as attack rate, or yung primary attack rate. Okay? So the numerator is the number of cases of disease during a specified time interval. And your denominator is the population of the start of the time interval. So incidence proportion class, or the attack rate, is yung una nagkaroon ng sakit in a population. So, sino yung pinakauna na nagkasakit? Okay? Secondary attack naman class is the number of new cases among contacts. Ibig sabihin, yung attack rate, the number of your attack rate, or the number of cases na unang nagkaroon ng infection, nakahawa pa sila ng next. Okay? Pang next batch of cases. So, that is secondary attack rate. Okay? Incidence rate is the number of new cases of disease during a specified time interval. And the denominator, some person, 2 years of observation or an average population. For example, ito naman class, incidence rate is the total number. For example, in 1 month, for the month of January, we have 10 cases out of 2,000 population. Okay, so that's incidence rate. Meaning, in 1 month, merong 20 cases, new cases of COVID-19 in a 2,000 population, exposed population. So, ang nag-positive doon is 20. Pwedeng ganun. That's incidence rate or person time rate. Okay? So, anong difference niyan with cases? Okay? Sa case kasi class, for example, ang difference itong dalawa, the incidence proportion and incidence rate, is incidence is proportionate to the number of individuals. Okay? Ano ba? In a population, for example, 2,000 yung population, 10 ang nagkasakit. Okay? So that's the incidence proportion. Ito naman class, total number kasi yon. Okay? Ang incidence rate kasi class, may time. For example, in just the month of May, for example, month of November lang, meron tayong case. Ang incidence proportion naman, yung total number talaga in a certain population. Secondary attack rate naman class is yung number na nahawa from the primary or yung first na nagkaroon ng sakit. Okay? The total number is incidence proportion. Ang nahawa from the attack rate is secondary. In a specified period of time, for example, month of March lang, that's incidence rate. Okay? Next is point prevalence. Point prevalence kasi is a number of current cases. Okay? Bago at yung pre-existing na case at a specified period of time over population at the same specified point in time. Okay? So, point prevalence yun. Wala na sabi ko kanina, on a specified period and a specified population. While period prevalence naman class, number of current cases, new and pre-existing over a specified period in time. For example, itong point prevalence is, from January lang. Okay? New case, the number of cases in January. Okay? That's point prevalence. Pero pag sinabi mong period prevalence, first quarter, from January to June. Okay? Ilan ang cases? That's period prevalence. Okay? Nakuha ba? Okay? Next. Wait lang. Loading. Okay, next is morbidity frequency measures. So incidence refers to the occurrence of new cases of disease or injury in a population over a specified period of time. Although some epidemiologists use incidence to mean the number of cases in a community, others use incidence to mean the number of new cases per unit in a population. So we have two types of incidence. We have incidence proportion and incidence rate. So how do you define these two terms? Wait lang. Okay. May visuals sa inyo class, may slides na nag-appear. Bakit kasi wala? Okay. So this type of incidence proportion and incidence rate. So incidence proportion, okay. So incidence proportion class, proportion is the proportion of an initially disease-free population that develops disease because becomes injured or dies during a specified period of time. Usually these are limited. So synonyms include attack rate, risk, probability, or getting the disease, and cumulative incidence. Incidence proportion is a proportion because the person in the numerator, those who develop the disease, are also included in the denominator. Kaya siya proportion. Diba? So, ito siya, incidence proportion or risk. Okay? Again, incidence proportion or risk is incidence or the proportion of an initially disease-free population that develops the disease, becomes injured, or dies. So, ito class, ang numerator is the number of cases in the disease or injured during the specified period over the size of a population at the start of the period. Kaya siya proportion kasi itong number of new cases is part of this population. Okay? So next, for example, itong incidence population, we have yung diabetes pa rin na study. Okay? So in this study of diabetics, 100 of the 189 diabetic men died during 13-year follow-up period. So calculate the risk of death for these men. Okay, so 100 deaths among the diabetic over 189 diabetic men. Okay, so you multiply it to 100 para makuha mo yung percentage. Okay, so it is raised to 100 or raised to the power of 2 para makuha mo yung percentage ng entire death. Okay, so if you notice, risk is equivalent to 100 death over 189 times 100. That gives you 52.9. Okay, so more than half yung risk of risk or the incidence proportion risk or incidence risk of death for diabetes. So another example, class, in an outbreak of gastroenteritis among attendees of the corporate picnic, 99 persons ate potato salad, 30 of whom developed gastroenteritis. So same formula. Your numerator is 30, denominator is 99, and multiply it to 100. So 30 divided by 99 times 100 is equivalent to 0.303 times 100 to get the percentage. So you have 30.3 incidence proportion or incidence risk of gastroenteritis of the people who attended the corporate picnic. Okay. So next we have properties and uses of incidence proportions. Kung kailan ba natin ginagamit itong incidence proportions. Okay? So incidence proportion is a measure of risk of disease or the probability of developing the disease during a specified period. Again, measuring the risk in or probability of developing the disease in a specified period. So as a measure of incidence, it includes only new cases of disease in the numerator. So yung mga bago disease are mga bagong incident lang kasi nga incidence proportions. So yung mga bagong sakit or bagong classification of illness in the population in a given period of time. Okay? So the denominator is the number of people or persons in the population at the start of observation. Okay? Because all the persons with new cases of disease are also represented in the denominator, the risk is also a proportion. Okay? So, ganun. Okay? So, properties of uses of incidence proportions. So, first, okay, in outbreaks, setting the term attack rate is often used as a synonym for risk. Okay? Attack rate is synonym for risk. This is the use of incidence proportions. Okay? It is the risk of getting the disease during a specified period, such as duration of an outbreak. Okay? Attack rate is also synonymous to risk. Okay? Overall attack rate is the total number of new cases divided by the total population. Again, overall attack rate is the number of new cases divided by the total number of population. Okay? A food-specific rate naman is katulad ng example natin kanina, yung potato salad, di ba? Food-specific attack rate is the number of persons who ate the specified food and became ill divided by the total number of persons who ate the food. Okay? So, ito yung example natin with the potato salad sa picnic kanina. Okay? And lastly, we have secondary attack rate is sometimes calculated to the document The difference between the community transmission of the illness versus the transmission of illness in the household, barracks, or other close population. For example, yung first or yung attack rate nyo is on a specific barangay. Okay? So, ilan ang nagkaroon ng attack rate or risk doon sa isang community? For example, we have 5. Okay? So, di ba makita? Okay, by the way, Miss Budolio, no, yung PowerPoint naman nito is nasa course ninyo. So you can access it anytime. Okay? So nandito ang slides na ito is nasa inyong course na. Okay? So PDF files 'yun. So pwede niyo nang palakihin. Okay? So ito kasi is PDF siya, so I cannot make it bigger pa. Okay? So secondary attack rate is sometimes calculated to document or difference between community. For example, yung attack rate is 5. Kasi yun yung nagkaroon ng first exposure. Okay? And then, lumabas sila ng bahay nila and magkalubilo sila sa ibang tao in the community also. So yung secondary attack naman is nakahawa sila ng another 5. Okay? So, those another 5 or the new 5 class is called secondary attack rate. Okay? Kasi sila yung nakahawa or sila yung nahawa from the primary or the attack rate or yung initial na attack rate. So that is secondary attack rate. Okay? Next is we have incidence rate or ito yung formula ng incidence rate. Okay? Incidence rate or the person time rate. Incidence rate class or the person time rate is a measure of incidence that incorporates time directly into the denominator. Diba? Sabi natin kanina, pag rate ang pinag-uusapan, kailangan in a specific period of time. Merong time in the denominator. A person time rate is generally calculated from a long-term cohort study. Okay, cohort? Long-term cohort follow-up study. So wherein enrollees are followed up over time and occurrence of new cases of disease is documented. Okay? So typically, each person is observed from established starting time until one of the four endpoints is reached. Onset of the disease, death, migration out of the study, or loss to the follow-ups, or end of the study. So yung apat na yung class, yun yung endpoint ng start or ng isang cohort study. Okay? For example, you enrolled yourself in a study. For example, the study is katulad nung kanina, yung diabetic, di ba? After ilang years, for example, after 5 years, you have a follow-up. Okay? So, ano yung observation nun? It's either nagkakaroon ka ng sakit or namatay, nagkakaroon ka ng sakit after the study or after you're being followed up. Okay? Nagkakaroon ka ng sakit or namatay ka. Umalis ka sa inyong lugar, that's why they weren't able to follow you up. So, migration of the study or natapos na ang study. Meron talagang endpoint yun. So, those are the 4 types of endpoints of a cohort followed up study. Okay? So, how do you calculate this type of incidence rate or person time rate? So, the number of new cases of disease or injury during a specified period over the time person was observed totaled for all persons. Okay? For example, initially, ang denominator nyo is you are 100 in the case study. 100 yung pinag-aralan ninyo. Okay? So, lahat yun, binigyan nyo ng medicine, okay, for example, and then after 12 years or 10 years, binalikan nyo. Okay? Sino sa kanila ang nag-develop ng sakit? Sino ang mayroong sakit? And after 10 years, sino ang may bagong sakit? Or sino ang nagka-develop ng sakit? So, that is the person time rate. Okay? Mayroong follow-up. Okay? Okay? So I think ito yung end ng ating discussion. No? Dito muna tayo mag-stop. Okay? So, incidence rate or person time rate. Okay? So do you have any questions so far before we end our conference? So again, we have three types of measurement ng risk class, no? We have ratio, proportion, and we have rates. Okay. So, ano ba yung important ng tatlong yon? Okay? So, we need, pag ratio class, yung measurement ng risk, it's either the denominator is not related to the denominator. Pag proportion naman, always, ang numerator is part of the denominator. Pag rate naman class, it is always in a specified period of time in a specific population. Okay? So, ano yung mini-measure naman sa risk? We measure mortality, death. We measure morbidity or yung having an illness, and we measure natality or birth. Okay? So, yun yung pinag-aaralan sa measuring of risks. So, next meeting, we're going to discuss the different rates, okay, different proportions for mortality, morbidity, and natality. Okay, so do you have any questions so far? You can, if you have questions, guys, you can unmute yourself or you can have it here dito sa chat box natin. Okay, so na-note ko na itong mga present class de la Reina, Montalban, Delubio, Carinio, okay, Constantino. Okay, so noted na ito sila. Okay, so do you have any questions so far? So by the way, class, after this discussion, I will going to post a course lecture, 3 lecture activities that will serve as your quiz for today's meeting. Okay, the deadline for this lecture activity will be on Monday next week. Okay, so may tanong pa ba so far? Do you have any questions? Okay. Kung wala na class, BSMT 2A, 2B Lab A. 2B Lab A, see you sa laboratory. Okay? So, questions pa? Do you have any follow-up? Okay? So, currently we are 29, no? Again, deadlines, I will, next meeting class, ating lecture will going to have quizzes activity. Okay, quizzes ulit sa Monday with regards to our topic for today. By the way, this presentation is already uploaded sa inyong course sa lecture. You can revisit it, you can print, and you can download it. Nandoon naman ito sa course sa lecture. And please submit yung for those students na weren't able to have a quiz yesterday, please message me directly so that we can schedule time for your special quiz. And for those students who weren't able to submit yung mga submissions for yesterday, na meron tayong activity na deadline kahapon, please submit it now. Okay? So, kung wala ng tanong class, BSMT 2B sa lecture. Okay? See you sa laboratory. Okay? So, bye everyone. Thank you. Coverage ng quiz next meeting will be itong discussions natin. Okay? Itong topic natin for today. Hanggang incidence rate. Okay? Hanggang incidence rate lang tayo. Pero that's the topic or that's the coverage for our quizzes activity next week. Okay? So may tanong pa ba kung wala na class? So see you sa laboratory. Okay? So thank you everyone and be safe. Bye.
Thank you, sir.